It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. As Denise said, my name is Caio KLEIN. I'm the Executive Director of an NGO called SOMOS. It's a Brazilian organization that works with LGBTQ rights within prisons. We work also with people living with HIV here in Brazil. And today I'd like to share some insights from our work at SOMOS, as well from my research in my master's in criminal science and my recent PhD in public health. It was a study about the relation between health, torture, and the structures of Brazilian prisons. I will be presenting some insights grounded in evidence from these studies and in my professional experiences about Brazilian criminal justice system. So I'd like to start by saying, as we like to say here, that LGBTQ people have existed in prisons since the very beginning of prisons. However, a public concern about this issue is quite recent in Brazil, as in other Latin American countries, of course. We could say that this debate really began in Brazil in 2014 with the publication of some master studies about this matter and with the first official resolution that established guidelines for the treatment of LGBTQ people in prisons. In the following years, a series of regional resolutions created specific wings. They created sections or cells for LGBTQ plus inmate in prisons. And in 2018, SOMOS launched a project called Passagens, looking to provide a national diagnosis of how LGBTQ people was experiencing incarceration in Brazil. So we were in a situation that the Brazilian state doesn't have any data about this matter, and we realized that we should do something, and we proposed this project to initiate a first study about this question. So we could publish this first mapping of LGBTQ incarceration in Brazil, and that was included in our book Sexuality and Gender in Prison. At this time, we also did a documentary. It's called Passagens, Being LGBTQ in Prison. The book, unfortunately, is available only in Portuguese. We are working to try a translation, but documentary can be watched on our YouTube channel with English subtitles. So new considerations on this matter can be found in the upcoming book, Transgender People Involved with Carceral Systems, International Perspectives by Ruffledge. Okay, currently Brazil is a kind of paradox in this regard. It's one of the countries producing a lot of knowledge, producing a lot of research and legal documents about this issue. That also, according to an international study by SOMOS senior advisor Guilherme Gomes Ferreira in his PhD thesis. And we call this a paradox because Brazil is also one of the countries that most violates human rights of LGBTQ peoples in prison. So at the same time, we are thinking and producing a lot about it, but we still being a country with a lot of violations of the rights of these people. So we know that Brazilian prisons are in terrible condition. This made Brazilian the Brazilian state being condemned by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And of course, it's important to highlight that Brazil has today the third largest prison population in the world. But in other words, we are working to ensure that ensure at least a minimum of dignity and rights for LGBTQ people deprived of liberty, because today is still really common reporting about inadequate access to food and water, overcrowding in prisons, and prohibition to family or intimate visits. This is still situations very common here. However, the specific conditions of LGBTQ inmates can be even worse. For LGBTQ, we can say that the access to rights in prison will be unequal. This means that they will be the last to access education, healthcare, or even food. So it's really common that we see that when these rights exist in prison, LGBTQ inmates are going to be the last ones to access something in prison. So the access to healthcare, for example, is closely linked to the recognition of their identities, of the recognition of the LGBTQ identity. Discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity remains a big issue affecting their access to health, dignity, and non-discriminatory treatment. And this was also included in a report from the Ministry of Human Rights here in Brazil and the Ministry of Health. So we have now recognition, a public recognition of this situation. Moreover, there are many frequent reports of physical and psychological torture on these populations. Sometimes trans women may have their hair cut in prison, and we also had situations where trans women were traded for food, like there was a thing. They often report abuses by prison guards, including sexual harassment. And it's also common for public manager of prisons here to overlook the importance of considering the rights of LGBTQ in prisons. In some cases, during training sections or visits to prisons, they might say, oh, this is a modern problem, or it wasn't an issue before, or even claim that LGBTQ individuals are seeking privilege in prisons. In this context, with support from Brazil Human Rights Fund, the efforts of SOMOS over the past 6 years have focused on training prison staff to properly support LGBTQ inmates. We've been implementing educational actions to combat violence in prisons, beside advocacy actions on this matter. So to finish, I'd like to highlight 3 key lessons about this work. The first lesson is that prisons need to collect data on LGBTQ inmates. This means documenting sexual orientation and gender identity information in a confidential manner with really strict ethical guidelines. We believe that by gathering this information, we can better shape public policies to address the needs of this population. Of course, this only applies to contexts where there will be no legal sanction for being LGBTQ. Also, we believe that prison staff should take responsibility for educating non-LGBTQ inmates about diversity in sexual orientations and gender identities. The second lessons comes from the study I mentioned before by Guilherme Ferreira. He did international research and found that the rights of LGBTQ inmates are better respected in countries with stronger social protective systems. In other words, social democratic countries that invest more in public service, in public policies, in social rights, they tend to respond more to the needs of LGBTQ inmates. Otherwise, countries where LGBTQ are persecuted by the state will obviously show little concern for their situation in prisons. The third lesson is that public policies for LGBTQ inmates must be developed with active participation of civil society and social movements. And this becomes easier when we find public workers who support the issue. During our visit prisons, we've seen LGBTQ staff and allies who are really dedicated to protecting those individuals and facilitating ongoing discussions. That's why we strongly encourage countries to implement continuous educational programs on gender and sexuality for prison staff. So these were just some brief comments on how we are trying to contribute to the development of this subject, and of course, I would like to uh, stay available, and SOMOS is available to continue debating rights for LGBTQ people in prisons. And I'd like to thank you, Modest, for the invitation to be here with you, and thank you, everyone, for the attention, and sending my best regards here from Brazil, hoping that today has strengthened our cause. Thank you.